The first part of the story tells us about a plant-eating virus that was discovered 3 years ago and nearly destroyed the Earth, causing people to contract autoimmune diseases from consuming contaminated food sources, atmospheric changes to increase the frequency of natural disasters, and low oxygen levels to cause people to start suffocating. Fortunately, the discovery of a cave containing 2 extraterrestrial artifacts, a warp engine and a sphere said to be utilized by aliens aiming to terraform Earth billions of years ago, gave our scientists hope of finding a new home for the remainder of mankind. They soon created Project Gemini, led by the chief scientist Steve Ross, who reveals to his team that the sphere was the Earth's beginning point in generating chemical components to create life and circumstances needed for humanity's survival. They will also utilize the warp engine to launch a spacecraft to Tess, a solar system hundreds of light years away, and begin opening the sphere to a new planet that will be the next Earth. Steve then introduces scientists, pilots, and military personnel who will be joining the mission. The following day, the spacecraft was launched into orbit, but just as they were ready to make the jump to solar Tess, the ship lost control, knocking everyone out. After they had recovered, they realized they had never been inside solar Tess and had no clue where they were. Peter, who oversaw the coordinates, was dismissed from his job since Steve blamed him for the mission's failure. Peter persevered in checking the engine room, and after a while, the rest of the crew was terrified when they discovered his lifeless corpse outside the ship. They come to agreement that Peter caused the mission to fail and made this decision entirely on his own. But Leona disagrees since she knew Peter would never do anything that would jeopardize the mission. David also confesses his sentiments to the crew, claiming that he committed to this journey when his daughter Rhea died, but now feels worthless because they are trapped in an unfamiliar place. Steve discovers that the planet in front of the spacecraft was really a better planet than the one that was in solar Tess after certain experiments were conducted on it. Steve feels optimistic that the operation may be carried out there even though they are unaware of their location. However, most of the team believes that this was a foolish move given their limited knowledge about it. But because Steve was the head of the expedition, they carried on and launched a ship towards the planet and crash-landed on it. It then flashes back to a recollection of Steve's wife, Amy, when he handed her a piece of the sphere and turned it into a bracelet to persuade her to join him on this mission. They were able to safely land on the new planet, but they were unable to return to the main ship due to a lack of fuel. Steve persuades them to continue their quest and search for a cave for the sphere. Fortunately, they discovered a cave nearby that resembled the cave they used on Earth. Back on board, Richard discovers slimes in the engine room as well as a tape left by Peter. They determine from the tape that Peter encountered a live entity within the sphere, which also caused the spacecraft to malfunction on its route to the solar system Tess. This Trojan life form, so termed because it breached the ship by hiding inside the sphere, followed Steve's crew and is now anxious for their safety. As a result, Ryan removes Steve from leadership, which Leona and David oppose because the mission would fail without Steve as the lead researcher. Ryan plays a recording that demonstrates Steve's knowledge that the sphere may produce other life forms while remaining silent to the team as evidence that Steve should be held accountable for Peter's death. Ryan disagrees with Steve's assertion that the situation had no bearing on their objective because they might have handled the sphere in a different way to prevent Peter's death. A flashback shows Steve and David hugging and catching up within the cave. Because David's daughter Rhea had died, Steve was concerned about David's mental state, which is why he didn't want David to join the expedition. David, on the other hand, argued that he was ready and that they could together change the course of human history together. Back in the cave, Steve exploits his relationship with David to persuade him to check the sphere's settings. They were astonished to see that the Trojan had already used the sphere to construct a nest with metal tentacles within the cave. As the Trojan approaches, David orders Steve to go, but Steve shoves him, leading him to fire a gunshot. They both point weapons at each other and only come to a halt once the Trojan has entered the cave. They hear growls and hisses from the Trojan, prompting them to return to the lander. Steve tells David that if he interferes with the sphere and their goal again, he'll be forced to shoot him. Ryan notices them and confronts Steve about not following his directions. Ryan punches Steve in the face because he refuses to obey his instructions and provokes him to use force instead. An alarm on the lander drove the crew to worry seconds later. Leona wakes up and cautiously goes about the ship, discovering slimes everywhere. Leona runs into Frank, who asks her to silently enter the laboratory area. When they discover the Trojan is inside, Ryan lets Leona out and shuts the door, prompting her to leave as fast as she can while Frank approaches the Trojan and screams in agony. Leona discovers the remaining members of the crew in the control room. Except for the backup generators, they lost contact with all the lander's systems. Steve understands the Trojan infiltrated the lander through the cooling system, signaling that the Trojan was intelligent. Steve accepts responsibility for all that has occurred, and then offers to restart the camera system so that they can smoke out the Trojan. David tells Steve to come back as soon as the cameras are turned back on. Steve narrowly escaped capture by the Trojan and was hauled back to the control room. The crew then puts together a plan to retrieve the Trojan from the lander. Steve suggested that the Trojan play the bull and the crew play the matador and runners. He places himself as the main decoy, leading the Trojan to the inter-hatch space in order to lure it out of the airlocks and roast it. As they take their places exactly as planned, Leona manually opens the air hatch, but the Trojan begins to interfere with the system. The Trojan then chases Leona outside the lander, and as she shoots at the monster, she gets toasted by the lander's thrusters. Trojan pursues and assaults them as they run into the lander, causing David to bleed from his arm. The plan succeeded, but they lost 2 team members along the way, Frank and Leona. Amy returns in another flashback, pleading with Steve to stay on Earth since she is pregnant. She also tells Steve about the vaccination she developed to cure the illness, but Steve has already made up his mind and storms out. A portion of the Trojan's black slimy tentacles was left behind when it attacked David a few seconds earlier. Steve examines the piece and after some testing informs David that he possesses the antibodies required to combat the viral virus that was eliminating life on Earth. Given how miserable David was, Steve encourages him by saying that this discovery will allow him to alter the course of history. He also discovers that the Trojan is a biorobot, and that its black robotic tentacles are a transponder that links to the sphere, which is how the Trojan invaded worlds such as Earth. Steve provides Ryan with details on the Trojan and how they should reset the sphere as David checks on Steve and Ryan inside the lab. Ryan made the decision to permanently lock Steve inside since he had had enough of him endangering the crew's safety. David agrees with Ryan's decision and accuses Steve of being self-centered and only concerned about himself. Another flashback in the film shows Steve bidding his goodbyes to Amy and their unborn child. Steve commends Amy on her vaccination success, but he still needs to go on this expedition. Amy believes Steve was selfish and wants to always be the hero, so she tosses away the bracelet Steve gave her and heads out. Steve returns to the lab and calls Richard to confirm their location by following the movement trajectories of the stars. He then realizes that they were on Earth 4 billion years ago. The Trojan then causes a bacterial infection in David's arm, causing swelling and mutation to spread throughout his body. He also notes that the shard found from the moment David shot at the sphere is the same one he used to make Amy's bracelet. He discovers that the Trojan sphere was the same one found on Earth, but at a different period, and because they were living in the past, their actions would have no effect. So Steve had just one goal in mind: to notify Amy about the extraterrestrial bacteria and assist her in developing the vaccination by manufacturing her another bracelet and engraving the information on how to connect it to the sphere. Meanwhile, Richard informs Steve that Ryan intends to blow up the sphere. He goes to the control room and attempts to persuade Ryan to lure the Trojan into the sphere, lock it within the airlocks, and blow it up inside the lander. David suddenly shoots Ryan, knocking him out. David appears to have gone insane as a result of the bacterial infection, claiming that he is doing all of this for his deceased daughter Rhea and deciding to stand with the Trojans. In the control room, he pursues Steve, but Steve can shoot him in the arms, forcing him to back off. He then waits for the Trojan to take the bait inside the lander after setting the bomb's countdown. David and Steve are engaged in a gunfight when the Trojan smashes the door and charges at Steve. Steve rushes as quickly as he can after firing at the Trojan. The Trojan then murders David just as David was ready to shoot Steve after being thrown down by him once again. As the timer was about to start, Steve ran. After a short while, the explosion occurred inside the lander, getting rid of the Trojan. Steve informs Richard that the Trojan has been destroyed. As the storm approaches, Steve chooses to return to the cave to contact Amy, hoping to relay the message before it's too late. Amy sees the engraved text on the bracelet light and carries it to the cave, where she enters the command of the sphere. She was able to speak virtually with Steve after a few moments. He gives Amy the antigen formula she needs to make the vaccination that will cure the sickness caused by the Trojan's plant-eating virus. He then says his final goodbye to her accepting his fate that he would never be able to see Amy and his kid on Earth in the current time again. In the last chapter, Amy is shown to have succeeded in creating the vaccine and achieved the title of Savior of Mankind, as shown by the fact that she was seen tenderly caring for their little child while surrounded by growing plants. Even though it was unknown what had happened to Steve throughout the years, it was plausible to infer that even though he had been unable to go back home, his mission had been a success and his sacrifice would never be forgotten. Thanks for watching. If you like the content, give a like and subscribe for more videos. See you next time.